It was supposed to be a simple flight home. Jonathan Carter, a 39-year-old U.S. Army veteran, had just spent a weekend at a military reunion, reconnecting with old friends, sharing stories, and remembering the past. He had looked forward to the trip, cherishing the time spent with people who truly understood the sacrifices of service. Now all he wanted was to board his flight, settle into his seat, and let the steady hum of the engines lull him into much-needed rest. Flight 187. A standard commercial flight from Atlanta to Denver. Nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary, just another seat in the sky, carrying another passenger home. Or at least that's what Jonathan thought. As he walked down the aisle, his carry-on bag in one hand, he nodded politely to the other passengers. He had been on hundreds of flights before, first during his years of service, then in the years after, as he built a civilian life for himself. Traveling had always been something familiar to him, something predictable. But today, that sense of predictability would be shattered in a matter of minutes. Jonathan reached his row, glanced at his seat assignment, and sighed in relief when he saw that he had a window seat. He lifted his bag, sliding it into the overhead compartment. It was a tight fit, but he made sure it was securely inside and not obstructing the aisle. Then he sat down, exhaling as he leaned back into the headrest. That's when the flight attendant appeared. She was a woman in her early 40s, with neatly pinned up brown hair in a crisp uniform. Her name tag read Lisa Moore. She gave Jonathan a quick glance, her eyes scanning his seat, then the overhead bin. "Sir, you need to place your bag properly in the compartment," she said, her tone neutral but firm. Jonathan frowned slightly, sitting up. "It's already in there," he replied, his voice calm. "It's not blocking anything." Lisa pursed her lips, clearly unimpressed with his response. "You need to push it in further or check it in." Jonathan glanced up at the bag again. It was inside the bin, not hanging out, not causing any obstruction. He had double-checked before sitting down. He had flown too many times to make such a basic mistake. "I can adjust it a little, but it's already secure," he told her, keeping his tone polite. "It's within the required space." For a moment, she didn't respond. Instead, she just stared at him. It was the kind of look Jonathan had seen before, a look that wasn't about airline regulations or policy. It was something else, something colder, something that made his stomach tighten just slightly. Lisa exhaled sharply. "Sir, I'm asking you to comply." Jonathan's hands tensed against the armrests. He didn't want to make a scene. He had always been someone who followed the rules, someone who knew when to pick his battles. But this wasn't about compliance. His bag was fine. The request didn't make sense. Still, he forced a small nod and reached up, shifting the bag half an inch further inside the bin. "There," he said, his voice still calm. "Is that okay?" Lisa didn't reply right away. She stood there for a second longer than necessary, as if deciding whether to push further. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away. Jonathan exhaled, shaking his head slightly. Weird, but whatever. For the next few minutes, he focused on relaxing. He adjusted his seatbelt, glanced out the window at the busy tarmac, and took slow, deep breaths. He had no idea that things were about to take a turn he never expected, because Lisa wasn't done with him yet. Minutes later, she returned, this time with a sharpness in her voice that hadn't been there before. "Sir, you are delaying the flight. You need to listen to instructions." Jonathan blinked, his brows furrowed. "Excuse me?" Lisa crossed her arms. "I asked you to move your bag, and you refused." Passengers nearby shifted in their seats, sensing the rising tension. Jonathan could feel their eyes on him now, watching, waiting. "I did what you asked," he said, his voice still controlled. "The bag is fine." Lisa's expression hardened. "Sir, if you do not cooperate, I will have to call security." Security? Jonathan's stomach twisted. What was happening? How had a minor exchange turned into this? His voice dropped slightly, trying to keep things from escalating. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding." But Lisa wasn't listening. She grabbed her radio, pressed a button, and spoke into it. "I need security at gate 22. We have a passenger refusing to comply." Jonathan's breath caught in his chest. Refusing to comply? The words felt like a threat, like an accusation of something far more serious than what had actually happened. The other passengers exchanged nervous glances. Some shifted uncomfortably, others averted their eyes. And just like that, he knew. This wasn't just about his bag. This wasn't about regulations. This was about power, about someone deciding that he wasn't worth listening to, that he needed to be put in his place. Jonathan sat still, his pulse pounding in his ears. He had faced worse situations in his military career. He had seen combat. He had been under actual threats. But somehow, this moment, sitting in a plane seat, being singled out for no reason, felt just as dangerous because he knew how these situations could go. He had seen the stories. He had watched the videos. He had heard the names of people who had been mistreated, manhandled, humiliated, all because someone in power decided they were a problem. And now it was him. The flight attendants were moving now, murmuring to each other. A few rows ahead, a woman whispered something to her husband. A man in the aisle seat shook his head but said nothing. No one was going to step in. No one was going to say, "Wait, hold on, this is wrong." And then, as if on cue, the sight that made his stomach drop, two airport security officers stepping onto the plane. Jonathan's hands curled into fists, his breath coming slower now. This was about to get worse, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do to stop it. Jonathan Carter had been in tense situations before. As a U.S. Army veteran, he had trained for conflict, for high-pressure moments where a single wrong move could change everything. But he never thought one of the most humiliating and terrifying experiences of his life would happen on a commercial flight, surrounded by silent strangers who watched but did nothing. He sat stiffly in his seat, his heart pounding as he saw the two security officers step onto the plane. They moved with purpose, their eyes already locking onto him as if he were a criminal, not a paying passenger who had simply asked for a moment to adjust his bag. The air in the cabin shifted, heavy with the kind of thick, unspoken tension that comes when something is about to go terribly wrong. This can't be happening. Jonathan forced himself to take a slow breath, willing his hands to stay still, his voice to stay calm. He had seen enough situations escalate for no reason, and he knew the wrong tone, the wrong expression, could turn this into something far worse. The officer in front, a tall man with a buzz cut and an unreadable face, spoke first. "Sir, we need you to step off the plane." Jonathan's pulse kicked harder against his ribs. Step off the plane? For what? "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carefully even. "Can I just ask, why am I being asked to leave? I haven't done anything wrong." The second officer, a shorter but stockier man with tense shoulders, narrowed his eyes. "You're refusing to comply with the flight crew's instructions." Jonathan's fingers gripped the armrests, refusing to comply. The phrase made his stomach twist because he knew exactly what it meant in a situation like this. It meant he was already guilty. No matter what he said next, no matter how logical or calm he remained, the decision had been made. The moment Lisa Moore, the flight attendant, had called security, he had lost. The silent passengers around him seemed to shrink back, their gazes flitting away. A few watched with thinly veiled unease, some with curiosity, but not one person spoke up. Jonathan inhaled deeply, clenching his jaw. "All I did was ask for clarification," he said, keeping his hands visible, controlled. "I wasn't being disruptive. I wasn't yelling. I just wanted to know why my bag was an issue when it wasn't blocking anything." The taller officer shifted his stance. "Sir, you need to exit the plane now. We're not here to argue." A cold dread crept up Jonathan's spine. The tone, the finality of it, this wasn't a request, it was an order. Jonathan glanced toward Lisa, the flight attendant who had started all of this. She stood near the front of the cabin, arms folded tightly, her expression impassive, as if she had nothing to do with what was happening. And maybe to her, she didn't. Maybe to her, he was already the villain in this story. Jonathan felt heat rise in his chest, the weight of years of training and restraint fighting against the injustice swelling inside him. He had served his country. He had risked his life more times than he could count. And here he was, being treated like a threat over a damn bag. Passengers began whispering, some shifting in their seats. The tension crackled in the air. A woman a few rows ahead glanced toward him, then quickly looked away. A man near the aisle took out his phone, discreetly recording. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his heart pounding in his ears. He could push back. He could refuse. But he knew how that would end. He had seen the news. He had seen what happens when someone like him, someone who looks like him, refuses to comply. And so with a breath that burned in his chest, he stood up. "All right," he said, his voice controlled but edged with steel. "I'll go." But it wasn't that simple. The shorter officer grabbed his arm, his grip too tight, his stance shifting into something more aggressive. Jonathan tensed immediately, years of training kicking in. Not out of aggression, not out of defiance, out of instinct. "Sir, don't resist," the taller officer warned. Resist? Jonathan clenched his teeth. He had done everything right, and now they were setting the stage to make it look like he was resisting. The cabin fell into eerie silence as the officers began pulling him toward the aisle. It was happening. It was really happening. A low, stunned murmur rippled through the passengers. More phones came out, screens glowing as they captured the scene unfolding before them. Jonathan felt humiliation burn through his skin as he was led past the rows of silent faces, some of them filled with guilt, some with fear, others simply indifferent. The worst part? The absolute worst part? No one said a word. Not one person said, "Wait, this isn't right." Not one person asked, "What did he actually do?" They just watched. And Jonathan knew they would remember this. They would go home, tell their families, maybe shake their heads at how unfair it was. Maybe they would even post the video online, let it go viral, let the world argue over what had happened. But in this moment, when it mattered most, when a single voice could have made a difference, they said nothing. The officers dragged him off the plane. The doors to the jet bridge slammed shut behind him. And just like that, he was gone. Inside the plane, the silence lingered. Passengers turned to each other in hushed whispers, eyes wide, hands gripping their armrests. The air felt heavy, as if something unspeakable had just happened, because it had. The flight attendants resumed their duties as if nothing had occurred, as if the man they had just removed had never been there at all. And Lisa Moore? She smoothed her uniform, turned on her practiced smile, and moved on to the next passenger, as if Jonathan Carter had never existed. The moment Jonathan Carter was dragged off Flight 187, the silence inside the cabin lingered like a heavy storm cloud. The passengers, some still gripping their armrests, others staring blankly at the aisle where he had been just moments ago, were left to process what they had witnessed. A few exchanged awkward glances, some muttering words of disbelief. But for all the murmurs, not one person had spoken up when it mattered. What they didn't realize at the time was that this moment would not be forgotten. A man sitting in the aisle seat of row 7 had recorded the entire incident. His hands had been shaking as he held up his phone, the absurdity of what was happening forcing him into action. He had never expected to use his camera for anything more than capturing photos of the clouds from above. But something inside him had screamed, "People need to see this." By the time the flight landed in Denver, that video was already spreading online. It started small, just a few shares, a couple of outraged comments. But within hours, it had exploded. "This is disgusting. He did nothing wrong." A veteran, a black veteran, removed from his flight like he was a criminal? Unacceptable. How many times does this have to happen before we demand real change? The hashtag justice for Jonathan appeared. First, just a handful of times, then dozens, then hundreds. By the next morning, it was trending worldwide. News outlets picked up the story almost immediately. The video was played over and over again, each frame a brutal reminder of what had happened. Jonathan sitting calmly, only for a flight attendant to escalate the situation. The moment security arrived, already treating him as a threat, the tight grip on his arm, the unmistakable humiliation on his face, the way no one intervened, the silence of the passengers as he was forcibly removed, the slamming of the jet bridge doors, sealing the injustice as if it had never occurred. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was a movement. Sitting alone in an airport security holding room, he ran a hand over his face, exhaustion pulling at his every muscle. His heart still pounded, his mind replaying the last hour in brutal, relentless detail. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But it was. The security officers had processed him like he was some kind of criminal, taking his name, questioning him, before eventually letting him go without any charges, but with a firm warning. For future reference, one of them had said, barely looking at him, just do what the flight crew says, even if you don't agree with it. Jonathan had bit his tongue, resisting the urge to tell the officer exactly how wrong that was. Even now, sitting there in the quiet, the weight of the injustice pressed against his ribs. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had been polite, calm, respectful, and still, this had happened. A buzz from his phone snapped him out of his daze, and then another, and another. Confused, he pulled it out of his pocket. His notifications were exploding. Dozens of missed calls, hundreds of text messages. His social media flooded with tags, mentions, and messages from people he didn't even know. Jonathan frowned, clicking the first message from his sister. Jonathan, call me. Your story is everywhere. His breath caught in his throat as he opened Twitter. The first thing he saw was his own face, a still image taken from the video, a video he had never seen before, a video that now had millions of views. He pressed play, and his stomach dropped. There it was, the entire thing. The humiliation, the way they treated him like a threat, the cold stares of the flight crew, and the worst part, the silence of everyone else. He read the comments beneath it, his hands tightening around his phone. I served in the military too. This is how we treat our veterans? Absolutely disgusting. Black men can't even sit in their seats without being seen as a threat. Sickening. Where's the airline statement? They better not try to brush this under the rug. Jonathan inhaled sharply, the weight of it crushing. This was so much bigger than him now. Executives sat in their offices staring at the video playing on a loop. Phones were ringing nonstop. Emails flooded in from outraged passengers, journalists, and advocacy groups demanding a response. Their first reaction was to downplay the situation. They issued a brief, weak statement. We are aware of the incident involving a passenger on Flight 187. We take all customer interactions seriously and are currently reviewing the matter to ensure our policies were followed. That statement backfired immediately. People weren't looking for corporate damage control. They were demanding accountability. The pressure mounted. Celebrities weighed in. Activists called for boycotts. Politicians demanded explanations. And then came the veterans organizations. Jonathan wasn't just a black man mistreated on a flight. He was a veteran. And the moment that detail spread, the outrage doubled. Groups released their own statements condemning the airline. This is a disgrace. A man who served this country should never be treated like this. Jonathan Carter put his life on the line for this country, and this is how he's repaid? A petition demanding that the airline fire the flight attendant and compensate Jonathan gained over 500,000 signatures within 48 hours. And then, the biggest blow of all, a lawyer reached out offering to represent Jonathan pro bono in a civil rights lawsuit against the airline. Jonathan sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, watching it all unfold through his phone screen. He never wanted this. He never asked for this. He had simply wanted to get home. But the world had seen what happened, and now the world refused to forget. His phone buzzed again. This time, a call from the airline's CEO. Jonathan stared at the screen, his pulse racing. They weren't calling because they cared. They were calling because they were scared. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Jonathan realized. For once, he held the power. Jonathan Carter sat in his small apartment, the dim glow of his phone screen illuminating his tense face. He had barely slept in the last 24 hours. His mind raced with thoughts that wouldn't quiet, his heart still pounding with the same frustration, humiliation, and disbelief that had gripped him the moment he was dragged off Flight 187. Everywhere he turned, his face was there. On social media, his name was trending. Hashtag Justice for Jonathan had exploded, turning into more than just a hashtag. It had become a battle cry. The news networks weren't ignoring it either. The video of his removal had made its way onto every major news outlet, CNN, NBC, even international stations. Tonight, we cover the shocking removal of U.S. Army veteran Jonathan Carter from a flight in what appears to be an unjustified escalation. Passengers on board Flight 187 watched in stunned silence as security forcibly removed the veteran, despite no visible signs of resistance. Jonathan sat frozen, watching himself being dragged down the aisle over and over again. The images seared into his mind, making his stomach twist into knots. How did this happen? He hadn't yelled. He hadn't resisted. He had only asked a simple question. And yet there he was in millions of homes across the world, being treated like a criminal. He put his phone down, pressing his hands to his temples. His military training had prepared him for a lot of things, but not this, not being the face of a fight he never asked for. Then came the legal experts. Every news program had one. Lawyers, analysts, former judges, they all weighed in. From a legal standpoint, this looks like clear discrimination, one attorney said on a primetime panel. The flight attendant's behavior suggests a bias. The question is, would she have reacted the same way if he had been someone else? We need to consider the systemic issue here, another added. This isn't just about one man. It's about how black men, even those who serve their country, are perceived as threats in situations where they shouldn't be. Jonathan exhaled sharply. They were right, and that was what scared him the most. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every veteran who had been disrespected. It was about every black man who had been wrongfully labeled a threat. It was about every person who had been silenced by people in power. And that meant this wasn't going away. It was only getting started. As the pressure mounted, the airline finally responded. But it was exactly what Jonathan expected: weak, detached, and full of corporate nonsense. We take all customer concerns seriously and are reviewing the events that took place on Flight 187. We remain committed to ensuring a safe and comfortable experience for all passengers. Jonathan scoffed. Comfortable? Safe? Where was his comfort when he was humiliated in front of an entire plane of people? Where was his safety when two officers dragged him like an unwanted package? The public wasn't buying it either. Social media erupted with backlash. This statement is a joke. You humiliated a veteran and this is your response? Nah, we need more than this. We need accountability. We need action. Apologizing when you're caught isn't the same as doing the right thing. Do better. Pressure mounted. The airline stock dropped. Investors started asking questions. And then the biggest hit came. The NAACP and veteran organizations called for a boycott. Jonathan's phone buzzed with an incoming email. It was from a civil rights attorney. And that's when he knew this was about to become a legal battle. That evening, Jonathan sat across from Lisa Graham, a powerhouse attorney who had fought some of the biggest civil rights cases in the country. She had represented victims of discrimination, police brutality, and corporate negligence. And now she was here for him. I've reviewed the footage, she said, her voice calm but firm. This is a clear case of discrimination, wrongful removal, and emotional distress. Jonathan ran a hand down his face. What does that mean for me? Lisa leaned forward, her eyes burning with determination. It means you have a case, a strong one. And if we do this right, we won't just get you justice, we'll change things. Jonathan swallowed hard. The weight of those words hit him. He had never set out to change anything. He had just wanted to get home. But now he had a responsibility. To himself, to every other person who had ever been treated like this. To every veteran who had given their everything for this country and got nothing in return. He nodded. Okay, he said. Let's fight. Lisa smiled. And just like that, the battle began. The lawsuit was filed the very next morning. The public reaction was immediate. News anchors called it a landmark case. Activists rallied in the streets. People flooded the airline's customer service lines, demanding real answers. And then came the interviews. Jonathan sat across from news anchors telling his story. Every word was a punch to the gut for those watching. I fought for this country. I never thought I'd have to fight just to sit in my own seat. The world listened, and the world cared. The airline tried to quiet the storm, but it was too late, because this wasn't just about Jonathan anymore. This was about all of us. Jonathan Carter sat in his apartment, staring at his phone as notification after notification flooded his screen. The world was watching, waiting, and most importantly, demanding justice. What had started as a humiliating, painful moment for him had become something much bigger. Social media was on fire with his story. Our justice for Jonathan had gone from a simple plea to an unstoppable movement. At first, he had felt powerless. Now, the entire country was standing behind him. Veterans organizations, civil rights groups, activists, and everyday people had taken up his fight. refusing to let this be just another forgotten injustice. And Jonathan could feel it. Something was shifting. The first wave of support came from veterans. Jonathan had spent years serving his country, and now his brothers and sisters in uniform were stepping up for him. The Veterans Association of America issued a public statement. Jonathan Carter is one of us. He fought for this country, and instead of being treated with respect, he was humiliated. We cannot and will not stand for this. That was just the beginning. Thousands of veterans, active and retired, joined the conversation, sharing their own painful experiences of being mistreated despite their service. One veteran, a Marine Corps sergeant, posted a powerful video. "I put my life on the line for this country. We all did. But when we come home, we're still treated like we don't belong." Jonathan's story, that's all of our stories, and it's time we change that. The video went viral, racking up millions of views within hours. The outrage spread like wildfire. If America could honor its veterans on the battlefield, why couldn't it respect them in everyday life? People were angry, and that anger turned into action. What started online exploded into the real world. Within days, protests erupted across multiple cities. In front of the airline's headquarters, in major airports, outside police stations, people were showing up. And they weren't just holding signs, they were chanting his name. "Justice for Jonathan! No more silence! Respect our veterans!" News helicopters flew overhead, capturing the massive crowds, the passionate speeches, the raw anger and pain fueling this movement. Some protesters held up American flags, not as symbols of blind patriotism, but as a reminder, a reminder that Jonathan had served under that flag, that all veterans deserve better, and that this wasn't just about one man, it was about the treatment of all people who had been wrongfully judged, ignored, or discarded. At one protest, Jonathan himself showed up. He had hesitated at first, unsure if he was ready to face the crowds, to be the face of something so much bigger than himself. But when he arrived and saw the hundreds of people standing for him, chanting his name, wearing t-shirts with his picture on them, he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. Stepping up to the microphone, his voice shook at first, but then he saw the faces of the people who believed in him, and he spoke. "I never thought my life would become this. I never thought I'd have to fight for the basic respect that every human being deserves." He paused, swallowing hard. "But now I realize this isn't just my fight. It's all of ours. It's every veteran who's been forgotten, every person who's been treated like they don't belong. And I promise you, this won't be the last time you hear my voice." The crowd erupted. Tears streamed down people's faces. The movement had just gotten stronger. As the protests continued, the legal battle gained momentum. A petition was launched calling for the immediate firing of the flight attendant who escalated the situation. A formal public apology from the airline. Changes to airline policies to prevent racial discrimination. A federal review of how police handle nonviolent incidents in public spaces. Within 48 hours, the petition had over 1 million signatures. People weren't just signing, they were demanding action. Celebrities began speaking out. Influencers, politicians, activists, all amplifying Jonathan's voice. This wasn't just about one wrongful removal from a plane. This was about changing the system. Under immense pressure, the airline scrambled to contain the damage. They released another statement, but it was too late. The boycotts had already begun. Major investors pulled out. Ticket sales plummeted. Customers canceled their flights, saying they refused to support an airline that treated veterans this way. They thought they could bury this, but Jonathan's story was no longer something they could ignore. And now they had no choice but to face the consequences. Jonathan Carter's fight isn't over. His legal team is preparing for battle in court. Activists are keeping the pressure on. Veterans are refusing to be silenced. The world is watching, and now we need you. Comment below. Do you think Jonathan will win his case? Do you believe the airline should be held fully accountable? Like this post if you believe in justice. Share it to spread the message. Subscribe for more stories that expose the truth. Because this is how change begins. Marcus Carter had never felt so exhausted in his entire life, physically, emotionally, and mentally. Emotionally, he was drained. His body carried the memories of every shove, every humiliating moment when those officers had dragged him down the narrow aisle of Flight 187, treating him like he was nothing more than a problem to be discarded. But worse than the physical pain was the emotional wound, one that kept reopening every time he turned on the TV, scrolled through his phone, or even tried to close his eyes at night. Because everywhere he looked, there he was. News anchors analyzing his every move. Social media debating whether he had escalated the situation. People tearing apart his past, his character, his intentions, as if he had somehow caused this to happen to himself. Marcus had trained for war. He had seen things most civilians couldn't even imagine. But nothing, not even his time in combat, had prepared him for this. This wasn't a battlefield he could escape. This wasn't an enemy he could defeat. This was something far worse. The weight of injustice that never seemed to end. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had fought for freedom, for his country, for people he would never even meet. But now he was the one who felt trapped. Simple things like leaving his apartment had become a struggle. The paranoia that followed him was suffocating. What if someone recognized him? What if someone confronted him? What if someone didn't believe his side of the story? The idea of facing the world terrified him. So he stopped going outside, no grocery runs, no walks in the park, no visits to the barbershop where the old men used to chat about sports and life, nothing. His world had shrunk to four walls and a screen where he sat watching his own nightmare play out on repeat. And the worst part? Even in the silence of his apartment, he wasn't safe from it because his mind, his own thoughts, had turned against him. Some nights, Marcus barely slept. He would lay awake, the weight of what happened pressing on his chest like a heavy stone. And when he did sleep, the nightmares came. Every single time. He'd find himself back on the plane, strapped into a seat, trying to reason with the flight attendant, watching as she turned against him, so quickly, so coldly. Then the officers would come, their voices sharp, their hands rough, their grip unrelenting. He'd feel himself being dragged through the aisle again, hear the whispers, the mutters of the passengers around him. None of them helped. None of them said a word. And then, just like before, he'd hit the cold airport floor. The door would slam behind him, and he'd wake up gasping for air, his heart pounding, his fists clenched, his body covered in a thin layer of sweat. The panic didn't go away immediately. It stayed with him, sometimes for hours. Some wounds aren't visible. Some injuries don't heal with time. And Marcus was starting to fear that this pain would never go away. The first time Marcus truly broke down, it wasn't dramatic. There were no slam fists or shattered mirrors. There was just silence. He had been sitting in his chair, mindlessly scrolling through the news when he saw a headline, "Veteran dragged off flight speaks out. Is he making too big a deal?" That was all it took. The anger came first, a flash of white-hot rage so intense he thought he might punch a hole in the wall. Then the sadness, a deep, aching grief that settled in his chest like lead. And then finally the hopelessness. Because no matter what he did, no matter how many people stood by him, there were always going to be those who didn't care. Those who thought he deserved it. Those who believed he was the problem. Those who saw his skin, his voice, his very presence as a threat. It was in that moment that Marcus Carter truly felt alone. And he wasn't sure how much more of it he could take. He might have drowned in that darkness. If it weren't for one phone call, it came late, nearly midnight. His phone buzzed on the table, and for a moment he debated ignoring it. But something told him to pick up. "Marcus?" It was his mother's voice, soft, worried, filled with love. And just like that, the dam broke. Tears filled his eyes before he could stop them. And for the first time since this nightmare began, he let himself cry. His mother didn't rush him. She didn't try to fix things. She just listened. But sitting in that chair, telling his story to someone who truly listened, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Relief, because for the first time he was being heard, not as a headline, not as a spectacle, but as a human being. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Healing never is. But Marcus wasn't alone anymore. And with every session, every conversation, he took another step forward. He wasn't just fighting for justice in the courts. He was fighting for himself, for his peace, for his strength, for the man he had always been, before that flight, before the world tried to strip him down. And this time, he wasn't backing down. Marcus Carter had started this battle as a man alone, thrust into the spotlight by an injustice he never asked for. He hadn't planned to become a symbol, a movement, or a catalyst for change. But now, standing in a room full of civil rights attorneys, veteran advocates, and policymakers, he realized that this fight was no longer just his own. It had grown into something much bigger. The airline, the same one that had ignored him, humiliated him, and tried to sweep his experience under the rug, was now scrambling to address the firestorm that had erupted around them. The police department, which had treated him like a criminal instead of a human being, was under intense scrutiny. And as his legal team pulled together every fact, every witness, and every disturbing pattern of past incidents, the truth became clear. This wasn't just about Marcus Carter. This was a systemic issue, and now the system was being forced to answer for it. Marcus's lawyers had spent weeks dissecting every detail of the airline's policies. What they uncovered was infuriating. There wasn't just one case like Marcus's, there were dozens. Passengers of color being disproportionately removed from flights, veterans with PTSD being denied patience and understanding, flight attendants abusing their authority, escalating minor disagreements into full-blown confrontations. These weren't isolated incidents, they were patterns, and now the airline was being forced to face them. Marcus's legal team filed a lawsuit that shook the industry, not just for damages, but for policy reform. They demanded mandatory de-escalation training for all flight attendants, a public passenger complaint system that logged every removal for review, a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, with real consequences for employees who failed to uphold it. A public apology to Marcus Carter and all passengers wrongfully removed in the past. At first, the airline's legal team fought back. They wanted silence, a quick settlement, a quiet end to the controversy, but the public wasn't having it. The protests hadn't died down. The petitions kept growing. Celebrities, activists, and public figures kept calling out the airline by name. Their reputation was in flames, and finally they realized there was only one way out: change. The airline caved. They agreed to every single demand in Marcus's lawsuit. For the first time in history, a major airline was being forced to overhaul its entire system of passenger removals, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. And when Marcus Carter stood before a podium, watching the airline's CEO apologize publicly on national television, the weight of that moment settled deep in his chest. It wasn't just an apology, it was accountability. And for the first time, he felt a shift in power. But there was still another battle to fight. The police officers who had dragged him off the plane, they were still on duty, still wearing their badges, still walking free without a single consequence for what they had done to him. The public wasn't okay with that. Neither was Marcus. His legal team demanded a full investigation into how officers handled airline incidents. They pulled body cam footage, interviewed other passengers who had been forcefully removed in the past, and uncovered a horrifying truth. Marcus wasn't the first. He was just the first one who had been seen. The pattern was undeniable. The police had been escalating minor airline disputes for years, treating passengers, especially black passengers, as criminals first and people second. The department had no choice but to act. They launched a full internal review, bringing in outside investigators to assess their officers' conduct. Then, for the first time in years, the department announced real reforms. New de-escalation protocols for officers responding to airport incidents, a specialized unit for handling nonviolent disputes, separate from standard police intervention, mandatory training in racial bias and mental health awareness. Officers who escalated unnecessary force would be disciplined or removed. And most importantly, the officers involved in Marcus's removal, they were suspended indefinitely. Marcus had expected them to get a slap on the wrist, maybe a short suspension, a private reprimand, but this was something real. For the first time, a police department was admitting that they had failed, and they were changing because of it. It had taken months of fighting, reliving the trauma, and refusing to back down, but Marcus had won. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been mistreated. At a press conference, standing before a crowd of reporters, activists, and supporters, He took a deep breath and spoke into the microphone. I never wanted any of this. I never wanted to be the guy on the news, the guy trending on social media. I just wanted to get home. He swallowed, feeling the weight of his journey settle in his chest. But when the system tries to silence you, you have two choices. You either accept it or you fight back. I chose to fight. He looked out at the crowd, at the people who had stood by him, at the faces of veterans, mothers, fathers, and strangers who had made his battle their battle too. And now we've proven that change is possible. We've proven that our voices matter. We've proven that they can just treat us like this and walk away. So to everyone watching, to everyone who's ever felt invisible, to everyone who's ever been told they don't belong, this is for you. This fight wasn't just about me. It was about all of us. The crowd erupted in applause, some cheering, some crying, because Marcus Carter had done the impossible. He had changed the system. The battle for justice is never really over. There will always be more voices to amplify, more fights to fight, more changes to demand. But Marcus Carter's victory proves one thing. No one is powerless. Now he needs you. Comment below. Do you think airlines and police departments will actually enforce these changes? What else should be done? Like this post if you believe in justice. Share it to spread the message. Subscribe for more stories about real people fighting for real change. Because this is just the beginning. Marcus Carter had never intended to become an activist. Before Flight 187, his life had been simple, structured, disciplined, and focused on service. He had served his country, followed the rules, and believed that justice was something you could count on. But now, standing before thousands of people at a rally, microphone in hand, Marcus knew that the world had shifted beneath his feet. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every veteran who had been disrespected, every passenger of color who had been unfairly removed from a flight, every person who had been silenced, humiliated, and ignored. His fight had become their fight. And Marcus? Marcus was no longer just a victim. He was a voice. When Marcus was first invited to speak at a veterans' rights rally, he almost said no. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a man who had ever sought attention or applause. But as he stood on that stage, looking out at the sea of faces before him, something inside him changed. Some people wore military uniforms. Some carried signs with his name on them. Some had tears in their eyes because they had been there too. They weren't here just for him. They were here because his story was their story too. Taking a deep breath, Marcus leaned into the microphone. I didn't ask for this fight. His voice was strong, steady, but I can't ignore it either. Because the way I was treated on that plane, it wasn't just about me. It was about how veterans, how people of color, are treated every single day. The crowd erupted, a wave of cheers and shouts surging through the air. For the first time since the incident, Marcus didn't feel helpless. He felt powerful. He wasn't just speaking about the injustice he faced. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And as he stepped off that stage, people reached out to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him their own stories. Marcus realized something life-changing. His pain had given him a platform. And now he had a choice. He could walk away, or he could fight for something bigger. The real test came when Marcus was invited to testify before Congress. A committee was investigating racial discrimination in air travel and law enforcement overreach, and they wanted Marcus to tell his story. Sitting before a room full of politicians, Marcus felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't a rally. This was Congress. This was the United States government looking him in the eye, waiting for him to speak. A congresswoman cleared her throat, adjusting her microphone. Mr. Carter, can you describe what happened to you on Flight 187? Marcus swallowed hard, his heart pounding. But then he remembered that moment on the plane, the way they had looked at him like he was less than human. And suddenly, the fear vanished. I was tired, he said, his voice clear and unwavering. I had just come back from a veterans reunion. I took my seat, followed the rules, and asked for nothing more than the respect every passenger deserves. He paused. The room was silent. And yet, within minutes, I was being dragged off that plane like a criminal. For what? because a flight attendant decided I was a problem before I even had a chance to speak. A few heads nodded, others shifted uncomfortably. Good. Let them feel that discomfort. Marcus took a deep breath and continued. I've been in war zones. I've faced danger most people can't imagine. But I have never felt the kind of humiliation I felt that day. His hands clenched into fists on the table. And I know I'm not the only one. This happens to people of color every day. This happens to veterans who just want a little dignity, and it has to stop. The committee members sat frozen, absorbing his words. One senator cleared his throat. What do you believe should be done, Mr. Carter? Marcus leaned forward. You want to honor veterans? You want to claim this is the land of the free? Then stop treating us like we're disposable. We need laws that protect passengers from racial discrimination. We need police officers trained to de-escalate, not escalate. And we need airlines to be held accountable when they let this happen. Silence. And then, applause. After the hearing, Marcus refused to slow down. He met with airline executives pushing for policy changes. He worked with lawmakers to introduce new passenger rights legislation. He spoke at universities, veteran events, and civil rights conferences. And with every speech, with every conversation, the movement grew stronger. Airlines started revising their policies. Police departments announced new training programs. And more people started speaking up. Months after his first rally, Marcus stood before another massive crowd. This time it was in Washington, D.C. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the faces of thousands of supporters who had gathered for one reason: justice. Marcus took the microphone one last time. A year ago, I was just another passenger, another veteran trying to get home. And for a moment, I thought my voice didn't matter. He scanned the crowd, taking in the faces, some old, some young, some black, some white, but all of them standing together. But I was wrong, because you all proved that one voice can turn into 1,000, and 1,000 can turn into millions. Tears burned his eyes. We are not invisible. We are not powerless, and we will never be silent again. The crowd roared, and in that moment Marcus knew this was only the beginning. Marcus Carter never expected that standing up for himself would ignite a movement. When he first set foot on that plane, he was just a man heading home. He never imagined that hours later, he would be dragged off the aircraft in front of dozens of silent passengers, his dignity ripped away with every humiliating step. And now, months later, he sat at a large oak table across from the very people who had dismissed, ignored, and mistreated him. The airline executives, their attorneys, their PR team, all of them were finally forced to face him. The tension in the room was thick, the silence stretching between them like an unspoken acknowledgement of everything they had done wrong. Marcus felt the weight of that moment. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had ever been mistreated by an airline, every veteran who had been disrespected, every black man who had been silenced. And now they had no choice but to listen. The airline's CEO sat stiffly, his hands folded neatly on the table. He cleared his throat, avoiding Marcus's eyes. Mr. Carter, on behalf of the airline, I want to extend our deepest apologies for what happened to you. Marcus said nothing. He just stared, letting the weight of those words settle in the air, because apologies meant nothing without action. The CEO continued, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. We understand that our flight crew mishandled the situation. It should never have escalated the way it did. We recognize that this incident has raised serious concerns about racial profiling, discrimination, and passenger rights. And for that, we take full responsibility. Full responsibility. Marcus raised an eyebrow, finally speaking. Responsibility means fixing the problem. So what are you doing to fix it? The CEO hesitated, glancing at his legal team. Then with a sigh, he unfolded a document and began reading the airline's official commitment to change. All flight attendants will undergo mandatory de-escalation training to prevent incidents like Marcus's from ever happening again. New anti-discrimination policies will be enforced, including anonymous passenger feedback on removals, to ensure that no one is unfairly targeted. A zero-tolerance policy for racial bias will be implemented, with consequences for employees who violate these policies. All cases of past racial discrimination involving passenger removals will be reviewed, and those wrongfully removed will receive compensation. Marcus Carter will receive a public apology from the airline, along with a substantial settlement for the trauma he endured. The entire room was silent. Even Marcus hadn't expected them to go this far. He had fought for months, endless meetings, protests, interviews, legal battles, just to be taken seriously. And now, they weren't just admitting fault, they were changing their entire system. For the first time since this nightmare began, Marcus felt something he hadn't in a long time: vindication. But there was still one more battle to fight. The police officers, the ones who had treated him like a criminal instead of a law-abiding veteran who had done nothing wrong. They weren't just going to walk away, not this time. Marcus's legal team had been relentless, demanding a full review of the officer's conduct. The department had no choice but to open an internal investigation. And what they found, it was damning. The officers had failed to de-escalate the situation before using force, used excessive physical restraint on a non-threatening individual, violated protocol by refusing to explain Marcus's removal, had multiple complaints of similar behavior in the past. Marcus sat in the courtroom as the internal affairs report was read aloud. For the first time, the truth was officially recognized. This wasn't just about Marcus. This was about a broken system that had allowed officers like them to abuse their power for years. And now they would face real consequences. The officers were suspended indefinitely. They were required to undergo racial bias and de-escalation training before being considered for reinstatement. A new oversight committee was established to prevent further abuses in similar cases. It wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was a message. A message that said, "We see you, we hear you, and we will not let this happen again." What started as one man's fight for justice had turned into a national conversation. Other passengers who had been wrongfully removed began coming forward. Airlines across the country announced similar reforms. Lawmakers introduced new legislation to protect passengers from racial discrimination. Marcus had started this journey as one voice. Now he was a movement, and that movement was unstoppable. At his final press conference, Marcus stood before hundreds of cameras. This was his moment, his last chance to make sure no one ever suffered like he did. He took a deep breath. This fight was never just about me. It was about something bigger. It was about every black man who has been told he's a threat before he even speaks. Every veteran who has been treated like a problem instead of a hero. Every person who has been denied their dignity because of someone else's prejudice. The cameras flashed, reporters furiously typing. This isn't the end. We still have work to do. But today we prove that when we stand up, when we refuse to be silent, when we demand justice, change happens. And if you ever find yourself in a moment where someone tries to silence you, tries to make you feel small, remember this: you are not alone. You are not powerless. And you do have a voice. The crowd erupted in applause, some people cheering, some crying. Marcus Carter had changed the system, but more importantly, he had changed lives. And this was just the beginning. The journey Marcus Carter had embarked on was never about attention, fame, or revenge. It was about justice, about proving that one voice, when loud enough, could shake the walls of institutions that had stood unchallenged for far too long. His story had become more than just a legal battle. It had turned into a national movement. What had started with a single injustice, being humiliated, removed from a plane, and treated like a criminal, had transformed into something so much bigger. Marcus had won. The airline had been forced to change. The police department had been held accountable. New policies had been implemented nationwide. But this wasn't just about winning a lawsuit or forcing apologies from those in power. This was about something deeper. This was about changing the system for the people who came after him. And Marcus, he wasn't done fighting. The world had seen what happened to him. The public had watched, horrified as a veteran, a man who had risked his life for his country, was dragged off a flight like he was nothing. And because of that, other people began to come forward. A black father in Texas who had been removed from a plane for not complying fast enough. A disabled veteran in Florida who had been forcibly removed after requesting assistance. A young woman in New York who had been ignored by flight attendants after reporting racial harassment from another passenger. The stories flooded in. Marcus realized that his battle had opened the floodgates for countless others who had been suffering in silence. And he couldn't walk away now. He became an advocate, not just for himself, but for all of them. He founded a nonprofit dedicated to helping victims of discrimination in public spaces fight for justice. He traveled across the country, speaking at universities, police academies, and aviation conferences, ensuring that his story led to real change. He worked with Congress, helping draft a bill that required mandatory de-escalation training for law enforcement officers handling civilian removals. Marcus wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a force for change. Through his journey, Marcus had learned harsh truths about the world. People in power don't change unless they're forced to. Justice isn't given. It has to be fought for. The silence of bystanders is what allows injustice to continue. When he was being dragged off that plane, no one stood up. People looked away. People filmed it, but they didn't fight for him in that moment. And that was something Marcus would never forget. But he also learned something incredible. When people come together, when voices unite, change is possible. After his story went public, people did stand up. They protested, signed petitions, demanded accountability. And because of that, the system was forced to change. That was the lesson. That was the truth. Injustice continues when people stay silent, but change happens when people speak out. One day at a conference where he was invited to speak, a young woman stood up during the Q&A session. Her voice shook as she spoke. "Mr. Carter, I want to stand up for what's right, but I'm scared. What if I speak out and no one listens? What if nothing changes?" Marcus looked at her, seeing himself in her fear, and then he said something that stuck with everyone in that room. People in power are counting on you to be afraid. They are counting on you to stay silent so that they never have to answer for what they've done. But if you refuse to back down, if you stand up and demand justice, you force them to listen. I was afraid too, but I realized something. Silence never changes anything. But courage can change the world. The room erupted in applause, and that young woman, she would later go on to become a civil rights attorney. Because words matter, actions matter, courage matters. And Marcus Carter had proven that. Years after his battle with the airline, Marcus stood on a stage at a major civil rights event. The crowd before him was massive. He had been invited not just as a guest, but as a symbol of what happens when one person refuses to stay silent. As he stood there, he reflected on everything that had happened. The injustice, the humiliation, the pain, but also the movement, the victories, the lives that were changed because of it. Marcus took the microphone. "I never wanted to be famous. I never wanted to be in the news. I never wanted to be the guy on a viral video. I just wanted a glass of water on a plane." The crowd laughed softly, understanding the sad truth in those words. "But when the world tried to make me small, I refused to let them. And because of that, things changed. Because of that, we are standing here today." So my question to you is this. When injustice happens in front of you, what will you do? Will you look away? Will you stay silent? Or will you stand up and fight? Because I promise you this, change does not happen by itself. Change happens because someone demands it. Be that someone. The crowd roared, some people cheering, some wiping away tears. Because they understood. They understood that Marcus's fight wasn't just about him. It was about all of them. Marcus Carter's story isn't just a story. It's a lesson about power, a lesson about courage, a lesson about why you should never stay silent when you see injustice. And now he needs you. Comment below. Have you ever witnessed injustice? How did you respond? What advice would you give to someone afraid to speak out? Like this post if you believe in standing up for what's right. Share it so that more people learn this powerful lesson. Subscribe for more real stories about people who refuse to be silenced. Because this fight isn't over. And as Marcus Carter has proven, one voice can change the world.